The road was dark. It was always going to be dark. That is the thing nobody thinks about when they imagine a night like this. Not the cold, not the rain, not the silence that follows something unthinkable. They think about the emergency lights, the sirens, the moment strangers arrive, and the world splits cleanly into before and after. But before any of that, before the ambulance, before the questions, before the story that would grip an entire nation, there was just a road, a lay-by. A couple who had driven out into the Worcestershire countryside on the evening of the 1st of December, 1996. Only one of them would walk away, and the one who walked away would spend the next 18 months telling the world a story about a stranger, a phantom, a faceless man in a dark car who appeared from nowhere and disappeared into nothing, taking a life and leaving no trace. She would tell it on television. She would weep. She would beg for information. The truth, as it almost always is in cases like this, was standing right there beside her. This is the story of Lee Harvey, his life, and the lie that nearly buried it. Lee Harvey was 25 years old. That fact deserves a moment to settle. 25, an age that still feels provisional, still feels like the beginning of the story rather than its ending. An age at which most of us are still working out what kind of person we are going to become. Lee was from the Midlands, a young man who had grown up in the kind of ordinary, decent circumstances that rarely attract anyone's attention and shouldn't have to. He was, by all accounts from those who knew him, a sociable person, warm, the sort of man who filled a room without dominating it, who had friends who genuinely liked him rather than simply tolerated his company. He worked as a mechanic, practical, skilled work that suited him. He was good with his hands, comfortable in the physical world, the kind of person who could solve a problem that defeated others simply by looking at it differently. His friends and family described a young man who was fundamentally straightforward, not complicated, not difficult. Someone who wanted, in the way that most 25-year-olds want, to build something, a life, a future, a sense of permanence. Lee had been in a relationship with a woman named Tracie Andrews for roughly 18 months by the time December 1996 arrived. Tracie was a former model, several years older than Lee, vivacious and striking, in a way that attracted attention. Those who knew the couple would later describe a relationship that looked, from the outside, like many others, passionate, committed, occasionally volatile in the way that intense relationships sometimes are. Lee Harvey loved her. That much seems clear from the accounts of people who knew him. He was committed to the relationship in a way that, with terrible hindsight, would later read as one of the great tragedies within a tragedy. That his loyalty was absolute and his trust was total, and that both of those things made him more vulnerable, not less. He had a family who adored him. A mother, Maureen, whose grief in the months and years that followed would become one of the most quietly devastating elements of this entire story. A woman who fought, with remarkable composure, not just for her son, but for the truth about her son. She refused, even in her darkest moments, to allow Lee to be reduced to a footnote. She would say again and again that she needed people to remember who he was, not what happened to him, who he was. Lee Harvey liked football. He liked a pint with his mates. He liked the uncomplicated pleasures of working-class English life, the pub on a Friday, the banter, the familiarity of a world he understood. He was not a complicated man, and there is nothing wrong with that. Uncomplicated men deserve to grow old. Lee Harvey did not grow old. On the night of the 1st of December, 1996, he was 25 years old, and he was alive. He was in a car, on a country road, with the woman he loved. That is where we have to meet him, alive, in the moment before everything changed. Because that is who he was, and that is who he always deserved to be remembered as. Tracie Andrews was, by any external measure, a compelling figure. She was 31 years old in 1996, and she carried herself with the residual confidence of someone who had once been professionally beautiful, who had stood in front of cameras and understood instinctively how to be looked at. She was not obscure. She was not invisible. She was the kind of woman who occupied a room differently from the people around her, and people noticed her. Former colleagues and acquaintances from the years before 1996 would later describe her in terms that were, on the surface, generous, lively, energetic, fun to be around. She was the center of social gravity in the spaces she occupied, the person others oriented toward. That is how it always starts. Not with a monster. Not with someone who announces their intentions through obvious menace or cruelty. It starts with someone magnetic. Someone who makes you feel chosen rather than trapped. Someone whose intensity in the early stages reads as passion rather than danger. The warning signs, as they almost always do, arrived quietly and were easy to explain away. And people who knew the couple in the months before December 1996 described a relationship with a recognizable texture of instability. Arguments, visible, sometimes public arguments, that went beyond the ordinary friction of two people navigating a shared life. Friends of Lee's would later recall occasions when the atmosphere between them shifted suddenly and without obvious cause, when what had been a pleasant evening became something tenser, something that made people around them uncomfortable without being able to say precisely why. There were accounts of Tracie's jealousy, a jealousy that those around them, again with hindsight, would recognize as something more structured than ordinary insecurity. An attention to where Lee was, who he was with, what he was doing. A monitoring quality to her interest in him that sat, in retrospect, at one remove from control. There were accounts of physical altercations between them, incidents that, had anyone been paying systematic attention, might have formed a pattern. But patterns are easy to see backwards and very hard to see in real time. In real time, each incident is isolated. Each argument is explained. Each moment of tension is absorbed into the broader narrative of a passionate couple who sometimes fight, because passionate couples sometimes fight. That is how it always starts, and that, in this case, is precisely how it ended. To understand what happened on the 1st of December 1996, you have to understand what the months before it looked like. Relationships of this kind, relationships that end in violence, rarely arrive at violence suddenly. They build. They escalate through a series of stages that domestic abuse specialists have documented with consistent clarity across thousands of cases. And the relationship between Tracie Andrews and Lee Harvey, as it emerged in evidence and testimony over the course of the subsequent investigation and trial, contained recognizable elements of that progression. The first stage is the establishment of intensity. It can be indistinguishable from love, and that is the cruelest part of it. The relationship was passionate from the beginning. Tracie was dynamic and compelling, and Lee, younger, somewhat more easygoing by temperament, was drawn to that energy. In the early stages, her interest in him felt like devotion. Her attention felt like care. The second stage is the emergence of control, disguised as concern. People who knew the couple in 1995 and into 1996 described Tracie as possessive of Lee's time and his social world in ways that became, gradually, more apparent. Questions about where he had been, assumptions about his intentions, a narrowing of the space he was permitted to occupy independently, not through stated prohibition, but through the emotional cost of independence. When going out with friends meant returning to an accusation or a row or a sustained atmosphere of cold withdrawal, it became easier over time simply not to go. This is isolation, and it is one of the most consistent warning signs in relationships that escalate toward violence. It happens slowly. It happens through emotional leverage rather than direct command, and it is almost never visible to anyone outside the relationship, sometimes not even to the person experiencing it, because it accumulates in increments too small to name. The third stage is volatility. The accounts of people who knew Lee and Tracie in 1996 describe a relationship in which rows had become more frequent, more intense, and occasionally more physical. There were incidents, friends recalled. An evening in a pub, according to subsequent reporting, in which an argument between them escalated to the point of physical confrontation. This was not, it should be noted, a secret. People saw it, people witnessed it, and people, as people do, explained it away. A rough patch. They always make up. It doesn't mean anything. It did mean something. It almost always means something. By the autumn of 1996, the relationship between Tracie Andrews and Lee Harvey had reached a point that, in retrospect, appears plainly unsustainable. The arguments were more frequent, the tension was more persistent, and on the evening of the 1st of December 1996, they had been out together to a pub in Alvechurch in Worcestershire, the kind of unremarkable social evening that thousands of couples spend every weekend across the country. And something had gone wrong. What precisely occurred inside that pub, or in the car beforehand, or during the drive, is something that the full weight of subsequent legal proceedings attempted to establish. What is known is that the atmosphere between them was strained. Friends who had spent part of the evening with them described tension. An argument had begun, or continued, or reignited. The precise choreography is difficult to reconstruct with certainty. And at some point during the drive home, Lee pulled the car into a lay-by on the B412, a country road between Alvechurch and Redditch. It was, by any reckoning, a secluded spot. Dark, quiet. The kind of place where there would be no witnesses. What happened next was catastrophic. By the time emergency services arrived, Lee Harvey had sustained multiple stab wounds. The wounds were severe, too numerous, too violent, too deliberate to admit of any reading other than the one that the physical evidence demanded. The nature of the injuries and the location and distribution of them would become central to the investigation that followed. Tracie Andrews was found beside him, distressed and injured. She had cuts and scratches consistent with a struggle. She told the responding officers a story. She told them that they had been followed by a road rage driver, a man in a dark car who had pulled them over, who had attacked Lee in a frenzy of inexplicable violence before disappearing into the night. She described him with the detail of someone who had genuinely seen someone: stocky build, short, dark hair, a distinctive jacket, staring eyes. She described him like a person. He did not exist. Lee Harvey died of his injuries. He was 25 years old. He died on a dark road in Worcestershire in the early hours of the 2nd of December 1996. The cause of death was multiple stab wounds. He did not die in a random act of road rage violence visited upon him by a stranger. He died in violence inflicted by someone who knew him, someone he trusted, someone he had driven out into the countryside with on an ordinary evening in the ordinary course of a life he expected to continue. The details of the attack itself, its ferocity, the number of wounds Lee sustained, are part of the court record and have been reported extensively. They do not need to be cataloged here. What they tell us, in the clinical language of forensic pathology, is something that requires no elaboration. Lee Harvey suffered enormously before he died, and he died alone on that road, in the dark, while the person who killed him prepared to tell a different story to the world. That story began almost immediately. Within hours of Lee's death, Tracie Andrews was speaking to police and, very quickly thereafter, to the media. Her account of the phantom road rage killer was vivid and consistent. She was distressed. She appeared bereaved. She had visible injuries, cuts and scratches that supported the narrative of a violent altercation. What she did not account for and could not ultimately explain away was the physical evidence. Evidence that, with each passing day of the investigation, told a story that diverged decisively from the one she was telling. Lee Harvey deserved better than to become a story about someone else's lie. He deserved, and deserves still to be remembered as the person his mother fought to keep visible, a young man who was alive, who was loved, and who was taken from the people who needed him by the person who was supposed to love him most. The investigation into the death of Lee Harvey was, from the outset, one of the most publicly prominent criminal cases in Britain in the 1990s. The road rage narrative was, initially, taken seriously. Or rather, it was treated with the seriousness that any account given by a bereaved partner at the scene of a violent death would receive. Police appealed for witnesses. They asked for information about the dark car, the stocky man, the distinctive jacket. The story was plausible enough in isolation to generate genuine public response. Road rage, as a concept, was receiving significant media attention in Britain in the mid-90s. It was a phenomenon that people recognized and feared, and Andrews' account fed directly into that ambient anxiety. The appeal for information produced nothing. No credible sightings of the described man or vehicle emerged despite extensive public attention, and meanwhile, the physical evidence was telling a different story. Forensic examination of the scene, and of Tracie Andrews herself, produced findings that were difficult to reconcile with her account. The distribution and nature of Lee Harvey's wounds, their location, the angles at which they had been inflicted, the number of them, were more consistent with a sustained close-quarters attack than with the frenzied, brief assault she had described. The evidence at the scene itself, including the position of the car and the physical traces within and around it, raised questions that the road rage narrative could not satisfactorily answer. Andrews's own injuries, the cuts and scratches that she had, which might have suggested a struggle with an unknown attacker, were, upon closer forensic examination, considered by investigators to be more consistent with the defensive injuries one might sustain in a physical altercation with someone fighting back, or, alternatively, with self-infliction intended to corroborate a false account. The investigation progressed, and as it progressed, the case against Tracie Andrews consolidated. She appeared on national television, in a press conference appearance that became one of the most replayed images of the case, weeping, clutching a photograph of Lee, appealing to the public for help finding the man who had taken him. It was a remarkable performance. It was also, as the jury would later conclude, precisely that, a performance. There was also the matter of the testimony of those who had known the couple, who came forward to describe the nature of the relationship, its volatility, the arguments, the incidents. This contextual evidence, placed alongside the forensic findings, built a picture that investigators and prosecutors were ultimately prepared to take to trial. Tracie Andrews was charged with the murder of Lee Harvey. Her trial began in July 1997 at Birmingham Crown Court. She pleaded not guilty. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence, the eyewitness accounts of the relationship, and the multiple inconsistencies in her account. The defense maintained the road rage narrative. The jury did not accept it. On the 28th of July 1997, Tracie Andrews was found guilty of murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that she serve a minimum of 14 years. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge something that is uncomfortable but important. Tracie Andrews was, for a meaningful period of the investigation, believed. The road rage story gained enough traction that it was pursued seriously. The speed with which she was able to inhabit the role of grieving partner, the public appeals, the television appearance, was, in retrospect, a form of manipulation that exploited both the media's appetite for the narrative and the genuine public sympathy that attaches to bereaved loved ones. This is not a failure unique to this case. It is a failure that recurs case after case in intimate partner homicide investigations. The person statistically most likely to be responsible for a victim's death is also, by virtue of their proximity, the person who receives the most instinctive public sympathy in the immediate aftermath. The lesson that proximity to grief is not the same as innocence, that those closest to victims deserve scrutiny precisely because they are closest, is one that criminal investigation has had to learn and relearn, and continues to learn. Lee's mother, Maureen Harvey, sat through the trial. She heard everything, and she had the strength to be present for it. Tracie Andrews was released on license in 2011, having served approximately 14 years. She had, according to reports, undergone significant personal change during her imprisonment. She had changed her name and her appearance, and she sought, by most accounts, a life of anonymity in the years that followed her release. Whether that is justice, whether 14 years is adequate, is a question that different people will answer differently. And it is not a question this program will presume to settle on behalf of the people most affected by it. That answer belongs, above all, to the family of Lee Harvey. Maureen Harvey, Lee's mother, became in the years following the trial one of the most quietly compelling advocates for victims of domestic violence and for the families of murder victims in Britain. She spoke openly and repeatedly about her son, not just about how he died, but about who he was. She made a point with extraordinary dignity of insisting that Lee not be reduced to a footnote in the story of the woman who killed him. She wanted people to say his name and mean him. The 25-year-old mechanic from the Midlands who loved football and his mates and a life that should have been longer. The Tracie Andrews case. And we must be deliberate about the fact that the case is named for the perpetrator rather than the victim, which is something true crime culture has begun to grapple with seriously. Became part of a broader cultural conversation in Britain in the late 1990s about domestic violence, about the dynamics of intimate partner homicide, and about the ways in which perpetrators can exploit public sympathy in the immediate aftermath of violence. It also contributed to ongoing discussions about media responsibility. The speed with which Tracie Andrews' road rage narrative was amplified, the press conferences, the television interviews, the public appeals, before investigators had reached any conclusions, drew criticism from those who argued that media coverage of violent deaths should proceed with more skepticism and less credulity toward accounts provided by people who were, at that point, unexamined as potential suspects. These are not abstract lessons. They have direct consequences for how investigations are conducted, for whether perpetrators are caught sooner or later, and for whether victims receive justice in time for it to matter to the people who love them. If you are watching this and something in it resonated with your own experience, if a relationship in your life carries any of the warning signs we've described tonight, please reach out. The National Domestic Abuse Helpline in the UK operates 24 hours a day. 0808 2000 247. You're not alone, and you do not have to wait for something to become catastrophic before you are allowed to ask for help. Lee Harvey was 25 years old. He was a mechanic, he was a friend, he was a son, and he was loved with the fierce, unconditional love that mothers carry for their children long after every other comfort fails. He was alive on the evening of the 1st of December, 1996. Alive in the way that 25-year-olds are alive, fully and without any expectation that the night will be the last one. He was more than the layby on the B4120. He was more than the lie told about him. He was more than the case number and the court transcript and the archival footage of a woman weeping on television. Lee Harvey was a person, and that is the only truth that deserves to be the last word. If this documentary meant something to you, please consider leaving a comment below with his name. Not her name. His. Like and subscribe if you want to keep watching stories that put victims first. We'll see you next time.